biggest South Asian media group, Y Media.
Today we will going to talk regarding the trucking industries. Recently wage rate in Lower Mainland, British Columbia. We want to welcome Glen MacInnes, BC Container Trucking Commissioner. Sir, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me.
Sir, can you provide an overview of the key changes in the 2024 increase for the container and trucking in the Lower Mainland?
Well, in 2014, our office was created as a result of legislation for dealing with container truckers. And one of the pieces of that legislation was that the commissioner would set a minimum rate for any driver who's performing container trucking services in the Lower Mainland. And since that time, we have introduced rates since 2015. And 2 years ago, I was appointed as the new commissioner. And one of the issues that was identified for me was that container trucking drivers were not keeping up with the rate of inflation, that the minimum rate had not kept up. And so I commissioned a report and a study that basically reviewed the rates compared to our competitors in Los Angeles and Seattle and in Toronto, and found that we were falling behind. So in 2023, I had introduced a concept of adjusting the rates to inflation, and we did that in 2023. And again in 2024, we're continuing with that, where we'll be increasing the rates for company drivers. Those are drivers who don't own their truck or they work for a company. They'll receive $33.66. And for independent operators, those are people who own their own truck. Those that are paid hourly will be paid $71.65 an hour.
So what factors influence the decision to implement these rate increase, particularly considering the timing alongside the general minimum wage rate increase in British Columbia?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in British Columbia, our minimum wage for all workers, employees in British Columbia is similarly increased, tied to inflation. And for the same reasons that we wanted to introduce it, what we were hearing from our licensees, the companies who actually employ these drivers or retain these drivers, is when there are rate increases, they were sudden and they were dramatic, because obviously they hadn't been looked at for a while, and the rates would, the commissioner would come along and say, okay, well, we need to increase the rates, and it would jump for about at some point 10%. And it would be a shock to the system. So the companies themselves weren't prepared for those increases or weren't given enough time. And for the drivers, obviously, they were falling behind quite quicker. So what the minimum wage in British Columbia was tied to, for that reason, the inflation rate, was so that everybody knew that there wouldn't be dramatic increases. What we would see were increases that were tied to inflation. And that's what we adopted here, that the commissioner's office, that's a sound concept, that there would be increases tied to the inflation rate, and given in enough time that the licensees can adjust to that and incorporate those changes into their business model. For example, we announced this rate increase, we're now in March, but they don't go into effect until July 1st, 2024. So that gives several months to those licensees to adopt those increases and provide the stability that we're all looking for across Canada to ensure that our West Coast is free of labor disruption.
So how are the stakeholders involved in the decision making process, and the feedback they did give you and they will provide regarding these rate adjustments?
That's a good question. So what happened was we had commissioned a third party called Cascadia Partners to do a very comprehensive consultation with all the sector, all the stakeholders in the trade sector, from drivers to organizations that represent drivers to licensees and organizations that represent licensees. This is very comprehensive. We then went out and had Cascadia do a comparison, an analysis of our competitors in Los Angeles and Seattle, Prince Rupert, and the ports in Ontario, to do a comparison to see what exactly is the typical rate, hourly rate that's paid to drivers, so that we obviously don't want to be non-competitive with those sectors, but we also don't want to fall too far behind. So what we had done was we interviewed those licensees, interviewed those drivers, got the feedback, and Cascadia then presented that in a fulsome report that I released, the full report to the industry, along with some recommendations that I felt I could glean from that report to the industry. Here's what the commissioner's thinking, how we're going to address some of those issues that were identified in the report. I then sought feedback from everybody in the industry to see if there's anything that I should be considering before I introduce those recommendations. I received all that feedback. I amended some of my recommendations based on the feedback that I received, and ultimately what we landed on was um, a rate increase. It's going to be tied to inflation, and we will review this process every 3 years.
Can you explain the methodology used to determine the new minimum rates and how they aim to address the disparities within the industry?
Right. So one of the indicators that we looked at was what was the rate set in 2014 when this legislation was initially created. And so, for an example, a company driver, is one of the tests, a rate was established in 2014. If we put that into, at that time, $2,022, is it keeping up? Is there a substantial difference between the rate that they earned in 2014 and the rate they would earn in 2022? And what we found was that they were about $2.50 hour behind, just for adjusting for inflation, that the rate had fallen behind $2.50. So there was a good key indicator that if it was sustainable in 2014 that the drivers received that rate increase, it would be sustainable in 2022 if we adjusted it for $2.50. Now, again, one of the things I talked about was that would be a major shock to the system if we were to introduce that on top of if you remember in 2023, that was a huge increase in the inflation rate as well. So what we did is we decided to spread that over 3 years, that adjustment, so that those workers would catch up by next year to where they should have been based on the 2014 rates. So that was one key indicator that we looked. Again, the comparator that I talked about was in Seattle and Los Angeles. Those drivers were making $37 Canadian, when you convert that into Canadian, $37 an hour. And like I said, we're now at $33. And we were slightly above Ontario and Prince Rupert. So what we wanted to do, one of our goals was to make sure that we we're still in that middle spot, whatever rate we increased, between Los Angeles and Seattle and Montreal and Prince Rupert. And we've captured that. We are still in the middle in terms of compensation level between those two competitors. And then thirdly, what we also wanted to do in terms of the methodology was to identify what's the cost of living that's going on here in Vancouver and certainly the Lower Mainland, where our drivers certainly live. The interesting thing about the trade sector in Lower Mainland is our drivers work here, they also have to live here. And certainly attracting those drivers and making sure that it was a livable wage, that they are compensated fairly, so that we can retain those drivers that can deliver the goods that all Canadians count on.
It's July 1, 2024 is the date you told us that this date will be the rate, effectively new rates will be designated. What measures your office will be taking care of that these rates are enforced in the industry?
Yeah. So one of our mandates in our office is we do regular audits of all our licensees. Currently, we have 74 different licensees. And so under the Act and the regulations, the Commissioner's Office has quite extensive powers to ensure that it audits each and every licensee to ensure compliance. That's one way that we ensure compliance. The second way we ensure compliance is that one of this exercise is to make sure that we get out to drivers that this is the rate that you're entitled to effective July 1st and any rate, and that if you are not being paid that rate, we have a confidence line, which is in confidence, drivers can phone our line and advise us that they're not being paid the regulated rate, because chances are if they're not being paid the minimum regulated rate, others aren't as well. And so from that process, we can send in our investigator to go audit and on site, including going on site to audit their books to make sure that the drivers are paid. And the consequences to those licensees if they don't pay the regulated rate is a fine up to $500,000 or suspension or cancellation of their license. And so it's quite severe for licensees not to pay the regulated rate. And by not taking those measures and enforcing that, what we're able to do is work with those licenses, say you have to pay that rate. And if you don't, you face a loss of your license.
Glen, looking ahead, what are the impacts of rate increase in the container trucking industry? What will be the impacts? And the broadly, if we ask you, what will be the impacts on the economy of Lower Mainland?
Yeah, so one of the things that we had done in our rate review, which was some feedback that we received, was the concern about if you just tie it to inflation, what other impacts can go on in terms of the drivers and Vancouver's competitiveness with the other industry. And so what we committed to do, obviously, is to review this process every 3 years so that we can capture any of those anomalies and making sure we're on the right path. And if we're not, and if it's not working, then we can course correct. And so that is one of the initiatives that was feedback that I received for the industry. I accepted it. I thought that was it was good governance to do that, to make sure that we also review the landscape to make sure that we're not pricing ourselves out of jobs, as it were, and making ourselves uncompetitive. So that's part of our process. We will continue to do that and evaluate, and course correct when we have to.
How does your Office of British Columbia Container Trucking Commission plan to continue the support the industrial growth and sustainability through the ongoing policies and regulatory reviews?
Yeah, so one of the key mandates of this office is to ensure stability in the industry. Just for reference, there was 3 labor disputes over a very short period of time in British Columbia that impacted all Canadians when drivers were underpaid, were undercut in their wages, and were not able to feed their families. And that caused the instability that disrupted the entire economy. So a key mandate of this office is to ensure that we find that balance of stability and affordability so that we can continue to have the ports available to all Canadians throughout the year and servicing the goods and delivering the goods in our exports as well to around the world. So that's how we support it. We also converse regularly with our federal counterparts. We also converse with the provincial government to make sure if there's changes in the industry that we're adapting to it and that we're making sure that that we're not having too many licensees chasing too few containers, which then ultimately leads to price cutting and certainly wage cutting, and ultimately gets us back into a problem of labor disputes. So I think our key contribution to the economy and certainly to the stakeholders is that we continue to find that balance that ensures that drivers get paid a fair wage and that licensees are able to operate in an environment that allows them to succeed.
Lastly, what message you want to convey to drivers, license and stakeholders regarding this rate increase and the future directions of container and trucking in British Columbia?
Yeah, I think my message to all stakeholders is this is really a partnership. Sometimes it doesn't feel like a partnership between the drivers and the licensees, and certainly government and regulators. That ultimately we all succeed when we have a well-running system, and that there's enough for enough business to go around to ensure that drivers get paid fairly, licensees are able to succeed in the business models that they have, and government through the representatives deliver for their constituents and certainly to all citizens of Canada, that there's a stability at the port, that they can count on goods moving through that port and avoiding labor disruption. So that's my message to everybody who's involved in this sector, that there are lots of competing interests, and we all understand that there's competing interests. But at the end of the day, this is the model that has successfully worked for 10 years, that has built some stability into the trade sector, that has delivered on those commitments that I talked about bringing stability to the ports. And that's my message to all the licensees and to the drivers as well, and every stakeholder is our office here is to continue. That's our North Star. That's where we continue to focus our energies on, and certainly understand where they're coming from, but hopefully they understand where the public's coming from as well.
Glen, thank you so much, Glen. Thank you for giving us time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
The biggest South Asian media group, Y Media.